Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivana.
Stop thinking about DEI as like a strategy. DEI is a metric. Belonging, on the other hand, is a managerial or leadership responsibility. If everyone belongs, no one belongs. And I think that's very true for teams.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Our workplaces are becoming more transactional, especially since moving to hybrid and COVID. Also, AI is providing a lot of us with a false sense of intimacy. And there's a growing loneliness epidemic. So the need for real belonging at work has never been greater. Our guest today is Don Berger. Don spelled D-A-N. He's a founder, author, and an entrepreneur best known for building social tables. The company was backed by top VC firms like Bessemer, Thayer, and 500 startups. And Don led the company's growth to over 20 million in ARR before selling in a 9-figure acquisition. Don is now building Assemble Hospitality Group, where they're creating micro resorts that are designed very specifically for team offsites and retreats, and really intentionally focused on fostering belonging. Despite leading a sizable exit, I love how Don speaks very candidly about emotion, intuition, and personal growth. And he includes really vulnerable stories from Alcoholics Anonymous, how he processed rejection, and how he had to learn to lead with more than just metrics. I think we're at a time where this topic is deeply relevant, and I'm really thankful that Don shares his ideas on belonging, what it means, how it's different from DEI, and what leaders like you can do today, from things like rejecting bad cultural fits through conscious exclusivity to designing better rituals in your meetings, in your systems, in your culture, and even in your retreats. Whether you're a CEO managing up to the board or you're leading your first team, this conversation will leave you with clarity and practical tools to foster a team that people really want to be a part of. Here is a wonderful conversation with Don Berger. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Tell us about how you came to starting Assemble Hospitality Group and some of the things you've done along the way.
I like to say that the biggest things happen in the smallest rooms. And for me, my love affair for small gatherings happened when I was a kid. I got all my friends together in my treehouse. And while that is certainly not an offsite or a retreat, I did realize how powerful they were when I was the CEO of a startup and the company I went on to sell in 2018. And I just saw that when me and a team got together and we sat down and we planned the quarter or reviewed the year or visioned out the next 10 years, the most beautiful things happened when we got together in the small room. And that's how I kind of came to the decision to start what I call a micro resort chain of places where people can come together like that.
Awesome. And you wrote a book based on some of the similar principles. And what I'd love to do, if it's cool with you, is get us started on the story of RG3 and RBG. And so if you can intro that for the audience and then kind of talk about why that moment really stood out for you, I think that'll lay the foundation pretty well.
Yeah, I went to business school. I went not knowing what accounting or consulting was. But a friend told me I should go to business school because it was a fun kind of way to figure out what you want to do in life. And I got there not knowing anything. And I figured that the best way to connect with other guys, because there was going to be 70% men in the class, was to talk about sports. The only problem is that I didn't like sports. I didn't watch them. I didn't play them as a kid. So I just started consuming SportsCenter and pretending like I enjoyed it and just kind of just sucked up that information of whatever was happening in that week in sports. In fact, by the way, I'm so ignorant about sports that I have to have Wikipedia on a second screen when I watch the Super Bowl in order to know the rules. So anyway, I went to business school, studied sports the week before in anticipation of meeting a bunch of dudes. And then when we got together, I wanted to comment on Roy. I think his name is Roy Griffith the Third or something, and he was called RG3. And I confused him to with the acronym or the initials of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I asked a bunch of guys in that like circle I was standing in what their thoughts were about RBG, and it just quickly they came to realize I was a total fraud.
I can relate a lot, by the way. I moved from overseas to Canada for college, and we used to call hockey ice hockey where I grew up. It's not something anyone got to play. It was in the Middle East, and then it's not something we certainly followed. And in Toronto, big Maple Leafs and Montreal Canadian fans, and I had to do the same thing. I would go make sure to watch those clips on SportsCenter to have something to talk about. I was 17 then. It's more excusable, I think, and I think it was the same thing. I just really wanted to fit in. I just really wanted to be accepted. And you've had a chance to think about this a little bit more. And when I saw a talk of yours earlier, you really dug into this concept of belonging, which for me had been kind of lumped alongside the other parts of DEIB, and nothing I'd never ever really gotten to kind of think about on its own and go deeper on. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So if you could maybe start with like giving us your definition of belonging as a starting point, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. So first of all, we refer to belonging as a sense and not like a feeling. It is a feeling, but we don't call it a feeling of belonging. We call it a sense of belonging. And that right there tells us that it's much more of a human experience, that we like a sense, and we intuit it more than anything. That's why a term, something like "you don't belong here," is so cutting, and so alienating and so othering. So now that we've established that it's a sense more than just a feeling or an experience, we can define it. And belonging, I define as the feeling and experience of feeling seen, valued, and respected in a group or environment that you're a part of. And the reason that's really important is because it's a symbiotic relationship between the individual and the environment, where there's constant reciprocal kind of flywheel effects between the individual who's feeling belonging or even trying to belong, and the environment giving it signals that it belongs, and vice versa. And those two things strengthen over time, and they kind of snowball in a good way, and you end up strengthening that until you don't belong anymore, or until you move on or stay forever. But that's my definition of belonging and why it's important.
And you say symbiotic there, and I think that's really interesting. It alludes that there's a little bit more agency that we have as the individual versus kind of the community or wherever we want to feel belonging or have that sense in. And so if you had to go back in time and give yourself advice on that first day of business school, instead of like trying to cram SportsCenter and football, is there something else you'd say to go in and do?
Yeah, I think I'd be myself. I mean, I think that part of the skills required to really master belonging is what I call rejection navigation. And rejection navigation is a two-way street. It's both being able to reject things that don't serve you, but also being able to accept rejection when it happens to you. So I think that, I don't know, like I think a bunch of different scenarios could work today. Like, for example, I could say, you know what? Sorry, guys. I just, I was a total idiot. I was trying to pretend like I know what I was talking about, and I don't. So, sorry. I can kind of like own it. That's one option, and really show my personality. And another option is to be my authentic self and talk about other things and not try to fit into what people are talking about. Another thing I can do is I can lead the conversation. And I can just, change the topic and try to move the topic somewhere else. Another thing I can do is just be quiet. Like, I don't have to show up and be a chatterbox everywhere I go. So there's just, it really depends on the context. It was the first day of school. So you're kind of like, everybody's kind of like sizing each other up.
Most of the folks listening are fostering teams of some kind, usually product teams. And I went to engineering school, and these aren't necessarily folks that, would fit into the high school groups that we grew up watching on TV and stuff as an archetype. And at the same time, their authentic selves are beautiful humans that have a lot to offer. And as leaders, there's a role that we play in terms of how we can help foster like a good balance of having everyone's authentic selves feel like they're thriving while also rowing that ship towards the ultimate goal of the team and the organization. And so for leaders out there, what's something that you find is oftentimes missed or something you'd want them to think about?
Well, I'd like them to stop thinking about DEI as like a strategy. DEI is a metric that informs us how we are doing in those categories. It is not the driver of bonuses. It is not the drivers of strategy or any of that. Belonging, on the other hand, is a managerial or leadership responsibility. And the leaders or managers can decide whether they want to have a sense of belonging on their team or not. That being said, if you want to have a sense of belonging on your team, then you got to practice conscious exclusivity. And you got to make sure you tell some people, you know what, this is not a good fit, or help them see that it's not a good fit. And that's totally fine. I like to say that if everyone belongs, no one belongs. And I think that's very true for teams.
Tell me a little bit more, maybe a practical example of that. I know you've run a bunch of teams before or you've advised others.
So when I was running Social Tables, which was my last company where I had my liquidity event, I was really eager to get the validation from my investors and kind of like recognition from my investors for hiring world-class execs. And what I realized too late, perhaps, is that our company was not really designed for these, what my board referred to at the time, gray-haired execs. And the reason for that is because we moved super fast. We didn't really care about ego. We put ego aside. And I brought on people who were just not a good fit, both in terms of our culture and in terms of what's called person environment fit, or person team fit, or person supervisor fit. They were just not a good fit. And I was doing it for reasons to please the board and be accepted by the board, when in reality, all they did was they were detractors. They were net detractors. And all the way to the point where my CFO at one point almost got me fired. Because he went to the board and tried to take over the company, and he was, I was going to talk some, but I'm not going to. So I ended up, my board actually saw, that he was trying to take over one of the board meetings, and that's what turned them against him. But I was really trying hard to welcome somebody who was just, square peg, round hole.
You were kind of caught between your instincts and which were and the board, and the board's got kind of a high level view of things, not necessarily the detailed view. And as the founder, as a CEO, you've got your eye on the pulse on these things. What was the CFO kind of, if I had to pick between your instincts and the board, was he more aligned with the board, or did he see the same things you did but was wondering, not understanding the friction you were facing?
We were driving through Sand Hill Road during our Series B raise, and we were in the back of an Uber, and there was tension throughout the whole kind of trip. But I saw him texting on his phone, and I peered over to see, what he was doing, and he was very oddly texting with someone with my name. And I was like, that's odd. I'm sitting next to him. Why is he texting with me? Or at least somebody pretending to be me, or somebody that he saved as me. And when I memorized the number and I looked at our employee, I cross-referenced it with our employee database, and I found out that he was having some sort of relationship. I don't know what kind of relationship, but he was talking to an entry-level employee. So, that right there is questions one's morals. But that's just one example. Another example, he's at a board meeting and he just, like I said, he completely took over that board meeting and presented in a manner and on topics that are way beyond what the CFO is responsible for in their wheelhouse. So it was very clear to the board at that point, apart from the unsolicited calls he was making to board members without my knowledge, and which one, by the way, I had to institute a rule on the executive team that if you're going to talk to the board, you have to let me know. I'm fine with you talking to board members, but you have to let me know. So he went behind my back talking to board members. And then he presented in a way that was completely outside of his wheelhouse. And they were just like, whoa, this guy is like, a bad apple. And the reality is that he actually created a toxic environment that was really hard for me to get out of, because that planted a seed. No matter how wrong or how much of a fallacy it was, it planted a seed.
This brings up a lot of conflict points for me that I've faced in the past, right? And I think I'll try and do my best to use some of the language you talked about, where there is this like rejection navigation we're trying to do. And if you're someone that has grown up for whatever reasons, kind of really in fear of that, it means you fear for it for others too, right? And, there's a couple of things that I think of here. One is, you got a little bit lucky where, whether you're spiritual or not, sometimes I make a joke that I'm not religious, but there's certainly a higher power, because there's no reason why I should have found out about this. And I've gotten similar clues about similar things about folks kind of acting in bad faith. At the same time, in those moments, I'm embarrassed to admit today that I was advocating for them, because I felt so strongly not wanting to push them out and reject them. And I negotiate against myself. And by virtue of that, everyone that came and stood on joined the mission that I was truly standing for this one individual that I was so afraid to actually, whether it's call out or reject or whatever. And hearing your story, it's very obvious that sure, you got lucky in terms of how you started to find out, but this person's acting in bad faith. You have to make these rules, which is another thing I'd want to negotiate against, where, people not
Especially
talking to
their
others.
common sense, especially their common sense rules. Hey, we're on the same team. Everybody's on the same team. Sometimes there have to be side conversations, but that's one of the things. Actually, by the way, sorry to cut you off. I just want to add to for your listeners. I think they'd find this very interesting. The CEO of NVIDIA doesn't believe in one-on-ones. He does everything in a team meeting, and he's got 60 direct reports. I'm not kidding, because he thinks that one-on-ones create politics and they create misinformation or information obfuscation. And plus, they're not an opportunity for feedback to be one to many. So he swears off one-on-ones.
I've heard this too, and I find it really interesting. It seems really idealistic, but obviously they're doing it at scale there.
Yeah, right.
And having a rule of you're not allowed to talk to someone unless you tell me sounds really archaic. But on the other hand, if you just kind of look at it with a lens of pragmatism, it makes perfect sense too. It's a very reasonable thing you're asking for. And so here's the question, right? Is like whether it's myself as a founder or another CEO out there that's caught in this throes of like, am I actually kind of being a little, in my case, I'd be okay, you're being a little baby, telling people that they can't talk to other people unless they tell you about it. Or paranoid, exactly. But when you zoom out, I've talked to the folks who kind of fit right in the core of like the culture I was building. And anytime someone like this was parted ways with, like the stories tell you, like they would come and be like, dude, why'd it take you so long to fire that guy? Right. And so what's the, like zoomed out, you've thought about this more than I have. What's the advice that you have for the leaders, the founders, when they're caught in the throes of that?
Yeah. First of all, there's so much here. So let's try to go a couple like rapid fire bullet points. Number one is like the flip, I don't like hire, slow, fire fast. I like hire fast, fire fast. Because you don't have time to hire slow. But it's hard, by the way, when it's executives, because then that really sends a message to the team, to the board, that there's some instability specifically coming from the CEO or the founders. But number one is that. Number two is being able to communicate your intuition. And I think a lot of people, we are in modern language, on especially younger people, they say, I feel like. What they're trying to say, and oftentimes they're not actually describing feelings. So I think what's better a better approach, instead of feeling like non-feeling, is actually knowing the feelings that we're feeling. And, anybody can go on Amazon and get a feelings wheel and figure out what they're feeling and communicating that. Like my wife and I had this like big kind of like perpetual issue around organization. She's much less organized than I am. And what I was really trying to communicate is that I feel unsafe without organizing. I feel that and that's the core problem. So once I'm able to communicate, I feel unsafe when we're not organized or whatever it is. I mean, I'm not going to feel unsafe if like there's no to-do list for the house, but there are feelings behind this stuff. So it's about figuring out. That's number 2. Number 3 is being able to communicate intuitions. And what I mean by that is oftentimes, instead of saying I feel like, you can use language like my intuition is telling me. And that right there gives a voice to your intuition, which we don't know how to express. And we oftentimes put aside. But the reality is that most of our nerves, the number 2 place for our nerves, the most nerves we have, is in our stomach. That's why it's called the second brain. So brain is first, and then second. We have nerves everywhere, but we have nerves in our heart, which is why people talk about their heart, like you're in my heart. So, but a stomach is in the second brain because that's the second most nerves we have other than the brain. So intuition has served us. It's protected us, and we got to be able to communicate it to other people. So those are really the 3 ways I suggest. Number 1, hire fast, fire fast. Number 2, communicate with feelings, lead with feelings. And number 3, speak your intuition.
You know what? Someone gave me advice. They weren't a board member, but they were kind of similar in terms of how much I looked up to them. And they said something very similar of like, hey, why don't you lead that with I have a hunch?
That's great too. Yeah.
And sometimes like as the founder, your hunches are oftentimes, they're almost by definition are ridiculous to the rest of the team, because you're thinking 3 years out and you're connecting dots that multiple team members are working on separately. And if you go in, like my mistake was I would go in saying, hey, this is what we're doing, and it sounds like chaos, and then just changing that language to I have a hunch would invite curiosity versus people trying to protect themselves or feeling confused and feeling afraid of their confusion, and saying like, okay, tell me more about your hunch. And in their case, I also trained them that, hey, I need to think out loud sometimes. So just whether you want to tune in or not, just ask me open-ended questions and then ask me to repeat the summary later. And I never really understood some of the like causation behind why it might have worked, and you just kind of unlocked some stuff for me there.
Awesome. Can I just say one thing about one-on-ones real quick?
Yeah.
We're talking about one-on-ones, and I think it's important. Like the way I'm starting to think about one-on-ones with my new company and my new team is a one-on-one is a format. It's not a topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a meeting. It's a type of meeting. It's a 2-person meeting. That's what it is. So calling it a one-on-one is actually really stupid. So what I would suggest is having different meetings with individuals that are shorter or maybe even asynchronous in order to address some of the things that are talked about in the one-on-one. So for example, if you're getting a budget update, you can do that budget update asynchronously, or you can have a budget meeting, but if you want feedback, if you want to collect it or give it, you can do a monthly kind of coaching meeting. That's either career focused or performance focused or mentorship, what have you. So I really think we need to deconstruct the one-on-one and think about what are the components in our current one-on-ones and how do we make those the actual thing that we're doing together.
And so this is something I'm feeling more and more naked as you're giving me these insights, because they're just reminding me of all these mistakes I made. And one of them was around, hey, I wanted to be, for someone who's maybe like very focused on outcomes and not necessarily hadn't learned to kind of play well with others, especially on like in an emotionally informed way. One-on-ones, almost felt like, okay, I think this is going to solve everything. And then we'd end up in these meetings, whether it's myself or like my directs with their directs, where there wasn't really an agenda in mind. And I think it got better when we kind of had more of a goals or a vision or something that we were trying to solve together, and we were in there acting as unlocks. But again, this feels a little anecdotal, and I'm curious from your standpoint, if you had to kind of, if I came to you saying, hey, what do I coach my managers in terms of what to make for an agenda, or what makes a good one-on-one, if they were to look back at the end of the meeting, what might that be?
So I'll tell you a story real quick, and then I'll answer the question. So I used to work for a member of Congress for 4 years. He recently passed in '94. Charlie Rangel, one of the most storied members of Congress of the last century. Not like the 1990s, but like he was in Congress for decades. And one of the things I learned from him is that after every meeting he had with any like stakeholder group or constituent or whatever, he would always say after the meeting, well, that was a good meeting. And just by the principle saying that, the people who attended feel great. So like Woody Allen said, half of life is showing up. Like that's true for a lot of meetings, especially when they're more, they're more like performative or theatrical or whatever. So that's number one, is making people feel like it was a good meeting. That's number one. Number two, look, agendas are funny. And the way I think about agendas is they basically, any meeting has two components, at least two components. There is standing agenda and new business. And a standing agenda are the things you go over every time, and new business is whatever you want to discuss or other people want to discuss. And there's those two buckets. And what I have found, however, is that over time my standing agenda changes, and I forget to use the standing agenda. But I keep it at the top of every doc to go back to it to see if I have to edit it or whatnot. So that's not like, that's not like rocket science. But I think that that's helpful. And, a lot of people like to do icebreakers in the beginning of meetings. I don't call them icebreakers. I call them heart warmers, because the goal is not to break the ice, but open the heart. An icebreaker suggests you don't know somebody, but a heart warmer suggests you get to know them, or suggests you're getting to know them more deeply. Now, all this being said, context is super important. You can't do a heart warmer with a team that's never met in person. You can't do a heart warmer if you're a very transactional workplace. A lot of workplaces, especially post-COVID, are becoming more transactional. We pay you a lot of money to show up, do your job, check out. You don't have to check your email at night, and that work-life balance is more important than ever. So the context is super important. Do you even want a culture of belonging on your team? Many people would say no. I just want it to be work. Work is work. And I think we're going back to that paradigm in post-COVID. And, I think that the pendulum will kind of, end up in the middle, eventually. But right now, I think people are overcorrecting on like very transactional workplaces. And that's even, we even see that in the solopreneur movement, the maker movement. It's all people kind of doing their own thing. So that's kind of the framework I would set up, is A, understand the context of the organization you're working in. Like, do you want the meetings to be deeper than just, checking, producing or ideating? Number one. Number two, if you do, then have a heart warmer that goes a little deeper than just like, what's your favorite color? And then, and it can go more deep as, the team, obviously you have to keep it professional, mostly. So that's number two. Number three, standing versus new business. And I think, what I like to do every meeting is in the beginning, go over all the to-dos people had, because people are then accountable to each other. A lot of times we leave meetings with a ton of to-dos, and they are never, they're rarely checked in on. So that's when I realized the chief of staff is really important, because the chief of staff, it checks in with executives or team members throughout the week to make sure they finish something. So it's basically, instead of a COO, it's like the CEO COO, which is a little different, because they're accountable to the CEO and not sometimes a peer. That usually happens in startups, two co-founders, CEO, COO, or, that's kind of silly. But I think of the chief of staff as the CEO COO.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product design or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. There's just been this push about belonging. And I love that you just kind of like question that assumption a lot to start of like, hey, make it an intentional decision as to whether or not you want belonging to be part of your culture. No one is going to judge you if it isn't. Just what's more important is that you choose yes or no, and then you commit to one or the other versus half-assing either, right? So I like that. And then, another couple of trends. Go ahead.
I have something really special I wanted to share with the listeners as well. I like to start meetings with also a preamble. And the preamble, I read the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I had asked my entire team to read it. There's so, I love meetings. There's so many fun things you can do. And I get chills about this when I talk about it. Like, what if we integrated like a business book club into every exec meeting where everybody reads like a page from somewhere and they discuss it for 2 seconds? Something like that, where there's also shared learning. We don't have a lot of that. We have a one-way learning. What about if we had shared learning in the beginning, especially if your core values are, learning and growth? But we started every meeting at my last company, Social Tables, with a preamble that was originating from the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it kind of went like this, and I'll screw it up, but it was, great teams do not hold back from one another. They're willing to admit their mistakes, and it went on and on, but not there's another sentence or two. And at the end, it ended with, they share what's on their mind without fear of reprisal. So that's how we started every meeting. And that was really powerful. I also like to stop. I run a nonprofit, and every time we have the board meeting, we read our mission statement in the beginning. So these are small rituals that anybody can introduce that are part of creating that belonging culture.
And this is something else that I think founders might negotiate themselves out of. I was guilty of it in the early days. These were things I wanted to do. And then would feel like, hey, I don't want to be too onerous on the team. I don't want to impose a bunch of things that make it seem like it's overly ritualistic. And what's the advice in terms of talking themselves out of that? Because it feels silly looking back for me.
Yeah. So look, I'm in a 12-step program, and 12-step meetings are exceptionally organized. They have a very specific process that no matter where you go, anywhere in the world, it's generally the same process. It starts with the serenity prayer. Or actually, it starts with a reading like, hello, welcome to the, AA or whatever program you're a part of meeting. We meet this time, etc. We're now going to go around introducing each other. Great. Everybody introduce themselves. Then we're going to read the serenity prayer, and then it goes on and on. And in fact, the preamble to every meeting in the program is like 10 minutes. And look, I understand. I mean, it seems like a to-do and a schlep, and sometimes I'm like, dude, we've been around these people for like years. Like, why? There's nobody new. Why are we reading this stuff? And I'm telling you, Ashok, every time that I listen to that reading or whatever it is, especially the acceptance paragraph or the promises, when I read those paragraphs, I've learned something new every time. Every time.
I 100% agree that they've been exactly the same impact for me. I show up as a different person to every meeting I've been to. Yeah. And I listen to a different subset of a sentence that I actually focus on and apply intention to. And it's a different learning. That aside, I think there's also a benefit of it. We're all coming in from different speeds. If it's at work, you're coming in from a different meeting. Maybe one person's coming in from a really great sales meeting and they closed a big deal. The CFO is coming in realizing, hey, we've had a big surprise, and you're coming in at two different energy levels into the same meet. Sure, it's your weekly level 10 or whatever, and having some kind of harmonization and reminding everyone kind of what the energy is going to be like here. And taking away any sort of confusion and uncertainty, I think does really well for our nervous systems that we don't give ourselves credit for. And that's what I've come to realize over time is that, hey, number one, if you're the founder, you get to decide what you want for this business. And people are counting on you to do that too. And secondly, there's a lot of benefit to these things that we haven't historically given enough credit to, that extremely successful programs like the AA meetings or any 12-step meetings have clearly shown that they've stood the test of time and still continue to work. So I love that you shared that. Thank you so much. I'm also someone who maybe obsesses about meetings. I take it personally when people say they hate meetings. And then you join the meeting they're talking about and you realize, yeah, okay, like they're both called meetings, but this one that they're complaining about just has all the energy and delight and joy sucked out of it and barely any problems or progress being made. And so it makes sense. So I got some tactical questions for you on this. Sure. What's your favorite heart warmer for someone who's looking to kind of introduce one? Like, what's an intro level one that you think is pretty good?
There are so many, and I have a list of them on Assemble's website, but a few that come to mind is, what's your personal mission statement? That's a pretty good one. Another one is, what's your favorite childhood memory? Or that something similar to that. Another one, as I love this one, is, if you can be a fly on the wall for any conversation in history, what would it be? Where would you be, and why? Another one, if you could study any subject and have a full breadth of knowledge about it, what would that be? And the reason I share all that is because, you and I are in a group called PEF, and I'm starting this thing called the Belonging Circle, where we talk, we help each other get into a belonging mindset, and kind of review what I call the belonging tank, which is what includes all of our belonging fuels. And when we did introductions, we did it in a way that was so amazing, because when you ask people where do they find their sense of belonging, you're going to hear things about a person you've never imagined. So, for example, if you asked me, I would tell you I find belonging by being a part of the reefing community. And that is, I have saltwater aquariums. So by being a part of the reefing community and taking care of my fish and seeing a beautiful tank, I get a sense of belonging. Or, for example, I would tell you, I get a sense of belonging from watching Peaky Blinders, the show on Netflix, to the point where I just got Tommy Shelby tattooed on my leg. So you find super interesting answers to those questions. And the goal is to create intimacy on a team if you are indeed trying to get belonging. And it's not like, oh my God, I'm fighting with my spouse. It's like, because that's not intimacy. Maybe it's intimacy in a one-on-one relationship you have with a colleague, but that's not how we want to show up to work. We want to show up to work as really interesting, colleagues. So that's why I think heartwarmers are really important.
The other thing that you talked about that I definitely agree with is post-COVID, there's a little bit more of a shift to a more transactional workplace. Mm-hmm. And, I don't necessarily have an opinion on which is right or wrong. I know it's one that I enjoyed less personally being part of. And there's different reasons for that. Some of the things that we did were, as we moved from an in-person office that I put a lot of my emotional energy to in Detroit to a hybrid workplace across the States, we would get together twice a year, whether in Detroit or in another place like Orlando or wherever. And we'd host 2-3 day workshops. On the best ones, we would go volunteer together and do stuff completely outside of, our own specific company mission. And you've had a chance to think about this stuff a little bit more. What is, first of all, what are some of the reasons folks should think about for doing these in-persons? I know so many hybrid teams that never, ever get together. And then we'll get into how to do it well after that.
I think any organization, regardless of whether they are remote or hybrid or even RTO'd, needs to get together outside of the workplace. If they, let's say, if they're like a 2 out of 10 of like wanting a belonging culture, or a 3 out of 10, obviously you need more of that when you want to get like to the upper, single digits. And there is different reasons why it's important. So for remote teams, according to McKinsey, productivity is not at all impacted by not being in the same office. There are two things, however, that are impacted, and that's safety and innovation. When you are remote, you don't get the same sense of safety you get when you're in person. That's because if I am your manager and I tell you, hey, Ashok, you're doing great, man, keep it up, you're not going to be part of the next riff. I can't really believe you unless I'm like feeling your energy in the same room, or I see that other people are not getting fired or whatever. I need to be able to see that. I can't just see somebody's left the Slack channel. So number one is for safety. And number two, that teams should get together in person, is for innovation. And innovation is much more possible when teams get together. It's just a fact. You and everybody that's listening knows this, so I don't have to go over it. As you go up the scale of wanting a culture of belonging, it's important to bring teams together in order to get closer, because there is research that shows that teams perform better when they do certain types of activities together, especially outdoor active activities. That's when they, go beyond the forming and the norming. They get to the storming and the transforming. So the research that backs that up. There is a challenge with remote teams because, there's no real estate budget. But I would argue just repurpose what you were going to use for real estate in order to fund these kinds of events, which should happen perhaps quarterly. And different teams do different things. Some companies bring the whole team somewhere. Some let, managers have a budget for getting their team together. Some just do the exec teams. So it really depends, again, on the culture, the budget, and so forth. But I think it's very important to bring people together because they're remote and hybrid for the reasons I mentioned, or if they're in person in order to get stronger as a team.
And hopefully there's folks out there now who've been convinced that we're on the fence about, should we do this? Should we not do this? How do we move this budget around? In our case, we just tacked it onto the onboarding budget. And, when you're kind of focused on your culture, there seems to be a little bit more wiggle room around onboarding versus something that seems like it's part of your OpEx. And then once you do one or two, it just seems like a no-brainer. You have something to say about the budget there?
Yeah, but we got to be really careful of not forcing people to do this stuff. And here's the thing. If you're on a team that's doing a retreat, you have to participate. But if you're a team that knows you're going to be in person, you shouldn't hire people who wouldn't participate. Does that make sense? Like you can't force people to do it because there's some people who wouldn't do it. I talk about the different belonging personas in my book. If you are a low need to belong person, which is a score you can quickly identify by going to my website, belongingquest.com/quiz. You can go ahead and take that quiz and find out where you are. But if there are people with a low sense of low need to belong, or people who are exceptionally introverted as it relates to or have an insecure attachment style where they can't really get close to people, you can't have, and you're at a high functioning like team that gets together in person, those people are going to feel left out. And, my company, we had weekly happy hours. And that was back when I believed that it's okay to have alcohol in the workplace. I no longer believe that. I don't think alcohol is any place in the workplace, but we used to have weekly happy hours once a month. It was actually sober. So it was drinks, non-alcoholic NA drinks. But I would judge people who wouldn't go to these events or wouldn't go to company events. And then I realized, well, no, these people had a sense of belonging outside of work. They weren't like me getting all their belonging tank filled from inside work. So I said a lot, and let me try to summarize it. Basically, the first step to figuring out if you should get together is deciding where you are and kind of like the desire to have a culture of belonging. If you are more leaning towards it, it should be it should be more. If you're less towards it, it should be less. And the ways to do it are in person, but you got to make sure you hire the right people who would want to do it. Otherwise, make it optional if it's not that critical. If you study like WeWork, for example, where they had like WeWork summer camp and stuff, I mean, that was like a co-ed party. And I think those days for startups are over. Like now it's about people who want lifestyle. They want to get paid a lot of money and they want to do really big things on their own. Like generally speaking, like I'm not in the startup world, so I'm probably wrong. But I think that it just changed. I just don't think you're going to see like a WeWork type culture where it's, or Uber type culture before, when Travis was running it. Like you're just not going to see that anymore. And that just creates, it's just eventually leads to toxicity. It eventually, like at social tables, we had 4 young women who got together in meeting rooms and planned how to tank our company's surveys when it comes to best place to work. They talked about 80% of the workforce. They planned how to get together without even like, in order to not work. They planned on leaving early and things like that. And all that said, if you actually think about it, it's a success story because those 4 girls who were fired at the same time because we found this out are now like really close friends to this day. So clearly we did a great job of it, bringing like-minded people together to the point where they sabotage the workplace. So, it's a double-edged sword. If you lean in on belonging like we did, where you create these kind of like with squads, or like Adam Newman, who had like a co-ed culture, this stuff is not healthy. So I think it's really important to hire the same type of belonging personalities, or make sure that it fit with your culture, your desired culture, or make sure there's a good balance without making things required.
This was I was part of this very fun company to work at, and we'd go out drinking multiple times a week in a much, much bigger city. And I got lucky in many ways that life brought me to a smaller city of Detroit. I didn't have as many phone numbers of people to party with. And then when I left the business and started my own, I had an opportunity to make a choice. And I'll acknowledge that it is a very literally seductive distraction to say, hey, if you add alcohol and partying to this mix, it's a great way to drive stickiness. Yes. And then thankfully I was maybe at an age where I was like, hey, I think you get to decide. And maybe some other lucky factors. Detroit's way more of a driving city than a downtown environment that I moved from. And so now it wasn't just a cultural question. It was like a safety question of like,
sure.
Hey, like, how people are not going to take Ubers despite you being able to comp them, or saying that you'll comp them, and I got lucky, I think, in many ways, and then that compounded into a culture that wasn't surrounded around drinking, and we found other ways. Mind you, it was a lot harder. Alcohol is like an easy cheat code. I just think it's like a very short-term one, which is maybe what you might have been alluding to as well, where I'm thankful for where we landed.
Young people are really drawn to those companies because they really don't have a sense of belonging on their own. And what I would argue is that organizations should do a better job of unlocking people's ability to find belonging outside of the workplace, because belonging through the workplace is okay. Belonging to the workplace is a problem. Let me explain. The workplace should be a platform for belonging, where you make friends, where you have interpersonal relationships, where you have your self-esteem by getting awards, wearing the t-shirt, showing off on LinkedIn. All those paths are paths to belonging, and that's totally okay. It's a platform for that. We can't put colleagues in a position where their only sense of belonging is the workplace. And as a result, if it doesn't work out, they end up really being back to empty, running on empty in that fuel tank. And that's what happened to me as a leader. I was getting everything out of my workplace, and I didn't have a sense of personal belonging in my life. And then I realized I was running on fumes. So what I would say is, yes, create a workplace if you want to, that drives as a platform for belonging, and play a role in helping people find their personal sense of belonging outside of work. And the way you can do that is, of course, from setting limits on work or expectations on work so people have time, giving, helping people get a home through preferred loan programs with banks or something like that, because homes are so important for people's sense of belonging. Helping people, encouraging people of faith, for example, to do whatever they need to do in order to get that need met. So honoring Fridays or Sundays or whatever days people have. So for example, for maybe Jewish people, Jewish colleagues, let them leave early on Friday, what have you, maybe Sunday night dinner. So start Monday late. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but, and also communicating faith, not in a way that's prescriptive or antagonistic, but in a way that people know it's okay. And again, I'm just riffing here, but helping people find their sense of belonging outside of work is super important. And part of that, by the way, is not requiring people to go to happy hours, which I learned the hard way.
Tell us then about the various archetypes or personas when it comes to belonging that you write about.
So if you can't tell already, I love frameworks, and I wanted to and I went to business school, so I love the 2x2 matrix. And the way I think about it is there are 4 types of personas. Obviously, you can be a hybrid, but it's a 2x2 matrix and I'll tell you the personas in a second. On the x-axis is your attachment style, and I break that down into secure or insecure. There are 4 attachment styles, but I kind of dumbed it down a little bit. And then there's a y-axis, and the y-axis is your need to belong scale score. And the need to belong scale score, attachment style is all about understanding how you manage interpersonal relationships, whether they're secure attached or not secure. And that's if you feel safe, if you feel seen, if you can do your own thing without somebody else and you're not codependent, and so on and so forth. It's usually decided by what happened in childhood. Not usually. It is decided by how your parents treated you, what you saw in the home, and so on. So the first thing is that's the attachment style. On the y-axis is your need to belong scale, and that is a statistically independent construct that tells us how much an individual actually desires to belong. And it's on a scale of 5, from 0 to 5. And, 0 to 2.5 is in the bottom, 2.5 to 5 is at the top. So now that we understand our matrix, we can go clockwise, starting at the top right. And that's what I call, the first one is eager belonger, or chimpanzee. That's basically the way I think about it is the chimpanzees are in the trees eating each other's lice, flirting, fighting, eating, sleeping, but they're a huge kind of group. They're in a huge unit, and they really get energy from being around other people, and they need a lot of ways to belong. That's because they have a secure attachment style and a high need to belong score. So that's the top right. Top left are meerkats. Those are anxious belongers. They do everything chimps do, but they do it underground, and they come out once in a while to check for threats. They are high need to belong, but insecure attachment. So they're just scaredy cats. And when they don't have other people around, they become insecure. Or they don't have, healthy adult functioning relationships. Bottom left are jaguars or snow leopards. They are reluctant belongers, and they basically have a low need to belong and insecure attachment. So they do their own thing. They kind of go and live their life on their own, but then when it comes to starting a family, they meet up. Or even when the kids grow up, the kids leave. So that's the bottom left. The bottom right are wolves, and those are independent belongers. They have low need to belong, or kind of like below 2.5 or around there, and they have a secure attachment style. And that's because they can straddle the fence. They can either do things on their own and get energy and vitality through activities on their own, or they can be with other people and get their belonging met that way.
We've all got teams, and since we're not hiring for any of these personas we just learned about, we've got a mix of them on our team. And let's say we're trying to bring them together and increase the connectedness, the belonging on the team, try new things. Maybe it's happy hours, maybe it's an offsite that we do periodically. How do we bring these folks together?
Yeah. So the first thing, if we bring them together for an event, it should be It should not be mandatory. If it's a larger group, it should not be mandatory. It should be at a reasonable hour, with a reasonable end time, with name tags so people don't forget who somebody is awkwardly. So at social tables, every new employee they got a magnetic name tag, like professionally made, which they wore at company events or when they went to support or meet customers. And alcohol should not be allowed. That's number one for larger groups. For smaller groups or any group really, you shouldn't hire based on belonging persona, but you should understand that different personas find belonging differently, and therefore it's not a one size fits all. And if it's going to be a one size fits all, it has to take all those people into consideration. So when it comes to an offsite, I think about they're either team building or like a mission driven offsite. Those are really the two categories. Usually it's a combination of both. So, when there's a meeting, obviously, a meeting is a meeting. You can't let people not attend. So a meeting is a meeting and everybody's got to attend. And ideally you have facilitation, which I highly recommend in order to make sure everybody participates. The reason I recommend facilitation, by the way, is because you can't facilitate and participate. It's like two sides of the brain. It's why we have sales engineers. They demo the product while the sales rep asks, questions and, shares features. So, that's the meeting side. On the activity side, there are many things you can do. For example, not necessarily do a sit-down dinner, but more of a buffet style, or more of a kind of like bar style, where you kind of have different areas where people can sit, so people are not necessarily forced to sit together if they don't want to and they get awkward. Obviously, you can do whatever you want to do. You can also make sure there's a little more structure to the eating and not just eating and trying to have awkward conversations. So there's structure to the meeting. You can do a Jeffersonian dinner. You can do the heartwarmers during the dinner. There's many things you can do. And then the activities, they need to take into consideration the team. If somebody is not have a poor immune system, you're not going to go on a public rafting trip. I'm just making. But my point is that you want something that's in the balance. You want something that fits the team. If it's a very active team for a very active company, then it's okay to go bike riding, or it's okay to go whitewater rafting, or it's okay to go do snow sports. But if it's not, you just have to take those activities into consideration, and you do something more chill or something more rigorous, depending on the team and what their needs are. But bottom line is not a one size fits all, and should take into consideration everybody on the team.
And so you're getting into sort of the agenda or the goals and the retreat design. Perfect. So, yeah. There's you've mentioned alcohol a few times, and I think, it's a checkbox now for menu design to cater to folks who don't drink. The folks who do it, check the box.
It's not for folks who don't drink. It's for protecting the safety, security of the team. Because we all know that colleague who's overserved, who then acts a fool, embarrasses, talks, gossips, what have you. And and God forbid, it gets even worse for, all the way down to assault potentially, or harassment. And alcohol is just a lubricant for all that stuff. So I just say, don't do it. You wouldn't give lines of cocaine to your colleagues. Why are you going to give them alcohol? It's like you're not going to pass a joint at all hands. I don't get it. Why is alcohol so different when it's so toxic? Number one cause of death, in terms of substances. There's no point. It's got no place in the workplace, in my opinion.
Hey, I'm glad you clarified that in terms of the menu for the retreats themselves. I was using it more as a metaphor as well, where new bars and restaurants opening up now have sort of part of their checklist of hey, we need to make sure this menu caters to people who don't drink alcohol, and using that as a metaphor of some of the bartenders will really take it on as a challenge and see the intended outcome and come up with a mocktail list that has a similar level of creativity and emotional energy put into that. And others will say, well, they can drink the pop on the menu. And I think the retreats have a similar sort of metaphor in that some CEOs come in and maybe tell their head of HR that, hey, we need to have retreats now. And there are a spectrum of how well designed the retreats are, in terms of there's the pop equivalent of like, hey, we got to do this. Let's just do all our meetings in person instead of like doing them on Zoom. And there's others who do it really well. And you've already given us some of the sort of more tactical do's and don'ts. If we were to zoom out a little bit, what's the kind of mindset you want to take on, I think, in terms of making that retreat a really memorable experience and in achieving the outcomes or the underlying facts of why to do it?
Well, I mean, I think so. First of all, I think you have to call it a retreat or an offsite. It depends what it is. A retreat suggests leisure, an offsite suggests business. So it's probably a combination of both for good teams, but it doesn't have to be both. I think just adopting a belonging mindset for those events, for those gatherings, and for me, that means like, you know, making sure that your goal should be to create a sense of belonging on the team. If you're committing to 3 days, 2 nights for a whole team and everybody like leaves their families and travels and, you know, changes their routine and their level of comfort in order to be together, then it's got to have an output, and that output, apart from the products you're creating or the plans you're putting together, that product or that output is a sense of belonging. And I think that every gathering should strengthen the sense of belonging, either for the team, or if it's a lifestyle retreat for a couple, or a breath workshop, then it's a sense of belonging for the self, with the universe or with my partner or whatever. But that's, you know, every retreat should have, or offsite should have, a sense of belonging as the kind of North Star. Even if you're producing something, because even if you're producing something, there's that shared work product you put together and the shared commitment to something great. So I think it's a belonging mindset.
And the location matters a lot. We've tried and struggled with finding the best places and figured ways out. It was a fair amount of duct tape holding it all together to get us the kind of the sense and the feeling that we were hoping for. And you could have done anything you wanted after your exit, and you decided to kind of double down on this space. So tell us about Assemble Hospitality Group and what the experience is like.
Well, the first differentiator that you hit the nail on the head is it's a bunch of vendor management, logistical nightmares and whatnot. And I know this is like every startup pitch, but we do that all for you. And we don't do it with some magical AI tool that everybody's trying to kind of like position these days. We do it with a human who actually does what's called retreat design. You say what your objectives are. We give you a menu, and then you choose. It's that simple. We take a 20% commission off the whatever the booking price is from the vendor. We pay them, so you don't have to deal with that. And that's it. It's like it's so simple. And usually our recommendation is you land in the evening, you check in, you do some sort of food activity, whether it's a chef, whether it's Uber Eats, whatever. Then you do a morning kind of like grounding exercise or something like that. I think, by the way, moments of silence and all that in meetings is kind of silly. But there is an opportunity to do restorative or wellness activities in the morning. Those should be optional. We have a hydrotherapy circuit outside in all our locations. We have like a CrossFit type kind of contraption as well, where multiple people can work out at the same time. And then people get together after the optional wellness. They can even go hiking. Our inaugural location is Boise, Idaho, opening in October 1st, 2025. And and then you do a morning meeting, a lunch, a morning meeting, an activity, and then a dinner. And you do that the second day, and then the third day, everybody leaves. Unless you want to do a morning meeting or something like that, and they leave in the afternoon. That's generally speaking, like in my opinion, what an agenda looks like. Sometimes you want maybe 2 days of meetings or a day and a half of meetings, and you can kind of still get that in that 3-day, 2-night model. But I think what brings it all together is that retreat design, which we do for people for free, unless they book through us, which is then 20% on top of what it costs.
Amazing. You mentioned AI there, and this is something maybe I should have brought up earlier. When it comes to belonging, and I don't know how many folks necessarily believe this. It's something I'm really afraid of, especially for young men out there, where I feel like there's going to be like, I'm so lucky that I'm not in my 20s right now, I think, because I feel like I'd be a prime target for someone who's getting bullied and or not necessarily having a place that feels like home. And AI is going to provide that for a lot of folks in the upcoming years. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, me personally, I think there's a lot of protection and defense we have to create so that we're not susceptible to it. And then we use it as a tool, and it's not where we find at home. I don't know if you agree with that or not. I have a hunch. So let me know what your thoughts are.
Your
what
hunch.
You're afraid of.
Yeah, I think your hunch is spot on, as most hunches are. I think that, so a couple things. Number one, I'm sure you saw this study that came out that said, or survey that said most young people prefer to talk to AI than a therapist. So, and I can relate, like if I have an argument with my wife, I go check what ChatGPT thinks. And it's usually like super woke and super like friendly. And it's like, you're both showing emotional dysregulation. I'm like, why aren't you telling me it's her fault?
You should use my ChatGPT. It's always siding with me, man.
It's like, I'm like, come on, man, just give me it straight. And he's like, well, but anyway, so, yes, look, I talk about this in my book, Men Are in Crisis. I think the best book on the topic is Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. He talks about how to fix this. Ideas from like redshirting, which is holding kids back 1 year because they develop slower, men do, or trade schools, investing in trade schools, or investing in like male nursing and things like that. Anyway, so we have a crisis. We have to address it. The loneliness epidemic is much worse than for men than it is for other folks, especially, by the way, and this is not PC, for white heterosexual men. I present as white. I'm North African. Doesn't matter. But I'll just use the we word. We feel like we didn't do anything to contribute to systemic issues. Why are we being quote unquote punished for it? And look, I mean, I get a lot of hate about this, but I think part of the DEI culture and the woke mentality is the problem here. So yes, we have to help men. Men are, and I can keep talking about the problems, right? Like men are coming of age later. They're not having sex early. They don't find partners. They don't get married till later. They don't get matched on Tinder. They're more likely to die deaths of despair, like suicide and overdose or alcoholism. So it's a big deal. Red alert. They're also more prone to tribalism and alienation and incels and conspiracies and fringe politics and violence. I can go on and on. It's a problem. And the solution is to help everybody, but especially men, find their sense of belonging bottom up. So it's not going to be some sort of preacher or some sort of president who comes around and says, hey, let's find how we belong, blue states and red states. No, it's the purple states, the United States of America, that famous Obama speech. That's nice. And that sounds great. And we can get behind that. We can get behind, ask not what you can do for your country, but ask for whatever. I forget what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Like, it's not that. It's about a bottom up solution. Each person taking a journey to find their sense of belonging so that they feel like they're a better fit in the world. And part of that is like I started a men's group with 28. Now we have 28 entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial guys who meets once a month, and it's super intimate. And there's the heart warmers in the beginning, and there's the chat, and there's the support, and we have forced one-on-ones so people meet each other, and so on and so forth. So there are frameworks to do this, and there are opportunities for men to do this, but they're not doing it enough. And my book tries to address that.
I love that. I think it's really important work. It's stuff that I've been very thankful to find upon, sort of by accident or serendipity. And I love that you're creating a much more intentional space that can hopefully help a lot more people with finding that.
Thank you.
A couple of things as we wrap up that I like to learn from all of my guests. The first one is, the podcast tends to be about fostering engaged teams that build really delightful products and experiences. If there's a team that you find particularly aspirational, or you go back to and try to recreate when you're leading, what's a team that you find very inspirational?
So let me start off by saying I have a couple of thoughts about teams in general. The first one, the kind of famous team of rivals that Obama put together, I think is super interesting. You know, he had Republicans and Democrats as secretaries, and I think they kind of got along. So that's pretty interesting. I don't necessarily like, it's hard to think about how to do in a business, but that's kind of an interesting data point. I think another one is, I think about like the allure of a team. And the one that comes to mind, even though I said I'm not a sports guy, is obviously any team that Coach K has run. And the reason I say that is because, you know, he has like his own thing. Like even I, like the anti-sport guy, even I know that he invented the triangle, and that's like a thing. Apparently some sort of play he does. But like that whole, you know, what we can learn from sports teams, specifically in college, by the way, is the kind of aura of the Green Bay Packers, which are, you know, owned by the fans. There are so many kinds of like things that great teams have. And that can be the flair, the rituals, the traditions, inside jokes, the soundtracks, the swag, all that stuff. So, those are just some things that I think make really good teams. The best team that I've been on has been, the early days social tables team. It was Ed Kim, my head of engineering, Ron Parimi, my head of sales, Trevor Lynn, my head of marketing. And I don't know if we even had a customer success person at that time. We eventually did. And we got together in my apartment because they had no budget. I still remember, we had a facilitator named Simon. And I still remember there's a picture of us from my loft. It was like a one bedroom kind of like DC with a loft thing. And somebody took a picture of us. I think Simon did. And we were all around the table and we were just kind of just kicking ass, putting together an awesome plan that really shaped the future of the company. And I just remember that team as being all in. And now those were the days, you know, and we all have that. And that's what you do as an early stage founder that's young, that can do that. But again, mental health is first. I always talk about each person is in their own number one circle. It's that middle circle we're all a part of. We have to put ourselves first, even before our spouses, our children. So you got to have the belonging outside in order to be that kind of safety net. But yeah, that's the team I think about how special that was.
I love that. And in terms of like a recent service that you experienced or a product that you unboxed, whether at work or at home, what's something that totally blew your socks off?
I mean, I love Home Assistant. I use that for automation, and I love from the Raspberry Pi all the way down to like the automations. That's at home. I'm really enjoying Granola, which records things on the desktop or laptop, as opposed to in the Zoom meeting or whatever. I love Attio, the new CRM. It's like bleeding edge and it's awesome. I love Clay for go-to-market. I mean, I can go on and on, dude. Like I really try to have the latest stack of everything.
That's awesome. You know, people choose either like experiences, places they've been, or products. I was really hoping that for an experience guy, you would pick experience. So I'm gonna kind of like force you a little bit to say like,
I mean,
where's somewhere you went recently where you're like, wow, someone put their heart and soul into this thing and it's come to life like how they intended.
Wait, what are we talking about?
Like similar to a product, but what may be an experience, whether it's a place you went, a restaurant, a resort.
I don't know, dude. I'm not like an experience bagger. You know, a lot of people are like, oh my God, I did this. I did a lot of cool shit. I went, scuba diving in Great Barrier Reef. I've done hot air balloons over like Myanmar where there's like thousands of temples. Like I've done some pretty cool shit, but like, I don't know, man. Like, my honeymoon with my wife.
Safe bet. I like it.
Yeah. Hi, Jen.
Awesome. Well, hey man, for folks wanting to get in touch with you, maybe join one of the groups that you're facilitating or to get in touch with your team at Assemble, what's the best way?
My website, danjberger.com, DANJ like in Joseph, Berger, BERGER.com. And that's kind of got a link to all I'm working on.
Awesome. Well, hey man, thank you so much for coming on, sharing a bunch of stuff that you've had a chance to think about and research and experiment with, and the level of vulnerability and sharing that you did. I learned a lot and enjoyed this bunch. If you ever want a wingman to co-facilitate a meeting anywhere, I feel like it'd be the most fun thing for us to do.
I think you'd be great. I think you are great.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
hope you enjoyed that episode with Don Berger. I personally found it super thought-provoking, and I wanted to highlight some of the takeaways that I had when I went back and listened to our chat. The first one is about how belonging is different from DEI. And some of y'all may recall that during an episode in our very first season, our guest Earl Newsom, the CEO at Cummins, shared a metaphorical definition that I tend to go back to often around DEIB. And he says diversity is being invited to dance. Equity is having access to the dance floor so you can get to the dance floor irrespective of your capabilities. Inclusion is being asked to dance, but belonging is wanting to dance like no one's looking at you. Listening to Dan put into perspective in the way he did, it did seem like the diversity, equity, and inclusion parts are metrics, and maybe a function of systems that you can operationalize alongside your HR department. But belonging is different because it's more of a sense or a feeling. It's less tangible, and there's even more of a need for it to be baked deeply into how you live your culture every day. That's if you decide that you want to have belonging to be part of your culture. Second, about how we as leaders need to get better about communicating emotion and intuition. I think in addition to being self-aware about our emotions and our intuitions and differentiating between them, I loved his advice on how to communicate those emotions and intuitions and be open that they are emotions and something that I'm feeling or something that I have a hunch about. And so he reminded me to say the thing, but also qualify it, whether it's a fact, which is backed by data and logic, or whether it's a feeling with an emotion or an instinct with intuition. So you can invite the people on your team that you're speaking with to best respond. Now, there's less arguing or questioning with facts and logic, but your audience is invited to poke holes or apply curiosity with what's behind an emotion or an instinct so you can make progress together. I think this is especially true for founders who tend to work off instinct a lot more, and super useful if you as a founder find yourself super surprised that your team doesn't get it. And what I've learned, as I mentioned in the episode, is if I start with, I have a hunch that, it really invites collaboration on the idea, whether the folks going to add to it or tear it down, and it helps build and bolster the idea itself. And arguably more important, it builds shared ownership behind that idea across the team that's going to help you execute it, which I strongly believe will increase the chances of that idea becoming a successful reality. The third thing is that rituals matter more than we think. Whether it's a short preamble at the start of a meeting, a shared reading and learning that we can reflect on together, or even a personal check-in like his heartwarmers that he talked about. It gives our meetings rhythm and meaning. Coming into the meeting from different places, everyone knows what to expect, and it harmonizes the energy amongst the participants of your meeting. And the last takeaway that I tend to agree with is that alcohol doesn't build culture, structure and consistency does. It's easy to lean on booze and a very seductive social shortcut, but I don't believe that the most connected teams need it, and it might also be a huge risk in your system. If you are feeling a gap on your team, whether it's energy, cohesion, emotional safety, or maybe belonging, I hope something here helps you take a step forward to fixing it starting tomorrow. Reach out to us on our website or our social DMs if you have thoughts to share or questions that we can help clarify. I would love to hear from you. We will be back next week with another episode on fostering engaged teams who build delightful products. We'll see you then. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.